So for this one, we're going to do something a little different. We're taking a really famous Korean story, Kim Ji-young, born 1982, and we're going to use it as a mirror. But instead of just looking at the story itself, we're actually going to hold that mirror up to Taiwanese society and see what the data reflects back at us.
You know, this line from the book just perfectly captures that deep feeling of being stuck that the main character, Kim Ji-young, goes through. It's this sense of being trapped by forces you can't even see. And that's exactly our goal today. We're going to use data to try and make those invisible forces, well, visible.
So why this book? Well, because Kim Ji-young struck a huge nerve, not just in Korea, but all across East Asia. It's widely seen as a social mirror because it reflects the kind of structural pressures women face in these societies, everything from the expectations put on them as kids, all the way to the penalties they face in their careers.
And yeah, that brings us to the big question, right? Is Kim Ji-young's story also Taiwan's story? Let's set the fictional narrative aside for just a moment and actually look at the hard numbers, the social patterns, and see what we find.
Okay, let's dive in. And we're going to start right where Kim Ji-young's story begins, in childhood. Because way before anyone even thinks about getting a job, there's this set of unwritten rules that quietly, but powerfully, sets the stage for inequality down the line.
We can think of this as the good girl playbook. From a really young age, girls are culturally sort of tamed with these kinds of instructions. And the crucial point here is that this doesn't just shape their behavior, it shapes their psychology. It kind of teaches you to blame yourself first instead of questioning the system. And that can really limit the confidence you need to take risks later in life.
All right, so now let's follow Kim Ji-young as she grows up and enters the workforce. This is where those subtle cultural lessons from childhood crash right into very concrete, very real structural barriers. And when we look at Taiwan, the data on this is, well, it's incredibly clear.
First things first, let's just talk money. If you look at the 2022 stats for industry and services in Taiwan, the average monthly salary for men was about 63,000 new Taiwan dollars, and for women, it was 52,000. I mean, the gap is right there in black and white.
So, what does that difference actually mean? Well, it translates to a gender pay gap of 18.3%. To put that another way, for every single dollar a man earns on average in Taiwan, a woman earns just about 82 cents. And this isn't just some random number, it's a real measure of systemic inequality. And this chart illustrates one of the big reasons why that gap exists. We're looking at what's called the M-shaped curve of women's labor participation in Taiwan. See how it peaks in their late 20s? Then there's this sharp, dramatic drop right during the prime childbearing years, and then it only kind of recovers. Now for Milne, their chart during this time is basically just a straight, high line.
And this dip, it actually has a name. It's called the motherhood penalty. And we have direct evidence for it in Taiwanese data. Studies show that having more kids has a negative impact on a woman's chances of being employed, but it has little to no effect on a man's. It's essentially a career punishment for becoming a mother, which is a huge structural challenge for a society that's also worried about a low birth rate.
Another huge piece of this puzzle is just looking at where men and women work. I mean, there's a clear segregation here. Over 70% of women are in the service industry. Meanwhile, a big chunk of men, about 40%, are in manufacturing and labor. This channeling into different sectors, which, let's be honest, are often valued and paid differently, is a major driver of the pay gap.
Okay, so let's follow Kim Ji-young from the office back home. Because after that paid workday is over, a whole other shift begins. And this one is unpaid, it's unrecognized, and frankly, it feels like it never, ever ends.
Sociologists have a term for this. They call it the second shift. But you know, in our digital age, it's really evolved into something more like invisible labor plus. It's not just about washing the dishes anymore, it's the constant mental and emotional work of managing an entire household.
I mean, just think about it, right? This is all the mental energy you spend planning, scheduling, researching, worrying. It's literally the project management of family life. And you want to know the worst part? This intense mental work often gets dismissed by other people as just playing on your phone, which means it's not just invisible, it's also completely invalidated.
Okay, now this slide, this is fascinating because it shows that progress is actually pretty fragile. The data shows that when a wife earns more money, her husband tends to do more housework. That's a modern trend, right? But look what happens at the bottom. The second the husband starts earning more, or when school-age kids enter the picture, all that progress just vanishes. The division of labor snaps right back to the old traditional roles. It's like the old structure is just sitting there, waiting to take over again.
And on top of all this physical and mental labor, there's this incredible social pressure. In Korea, this showed up in this really awful derogatory term, mom bugs, a vicious label that basically implies stay-at-home moms are parasites living off their husbands. This kind of stigma just adds a heavy layer of psychological distress, creating this awful double bind that punishes women whether they work outside the home or inside it.
So, the mirror has shown us the problem. It's reflected right there in the hard data. So the obvious next question is, what can we possibly do about it? Let's take a look at the path forward.
Now, when we compare policy, we see two totally different approaches. South Korea has gone with a much more forceful, mandatory strategy. They use legally binding quotas to force an increase in female representation, especially in areas like academia. Taiwan, on the other hand, has relied more on advocacy and getting institutions to voluntarily adopt changes. You could say one is a hard push and the other is more of a gentle pull.
So, based on all the issues we've seen, experts are suggesting a few key things. First, enforce salary transparency to tackle that pay gap head-on. Second, create real incentives for men to take parental leave to help rebalance childcare. Third, actually start teaching the value of invisible labor in schools to change the culture from the ground up. And finally, expand public childcare to help ease the burden on families.
But, and this is the final, crucial point, policy changes are only half the battle. When Kim Ji-young, born 1982, came out in Korea, the social backlash was enormous. It proved that when you challenge these traditional power structures, even just in a fictional story, it can trigger some really deep anxiety and resistance in society.
And that leaves us with this one last big question. We can write new laws, we can implement new policies, and we can do it pretty fast. But can we change hearts and minds, the culture itself, at the same speed? That tension, between how fast policy can move and how slow and difficult it is for society to evolve, that might be the ultimate challenge on the path to true equality.